The moment the Cathari warlord finished reading the declaration, the entire chamber went silent. Every diplomat, every ambassador, every ancient elder from every species that had gathered inside the grand conclave held their breath. 47 civilizations, some of them older than recorded human history, sat perfectly still. The silence was the kind that comes before a storm. The Cathari warlord, Drathon Vel, stood at the center podium with his crest raised high and his 4 arms spread wide, expecting something specific from the human delegation seated in the far left gallery. He expected fear. He expected pale faces and trembling hands. He expected at least one human to faint, maybe 2. What he got was me laughing so hard, I nearly fell out of my chair. My name is Sira Voss. At the time, I was the senior human representative to the Galactic Diplomatic Corps, which is a fancy title for the person who sits in rooms full of alien dignitaries and tries not to say something that accidentally starts a war. I had been doing this job for 11 years. I had navigated trade disputes between species that communicated through color changes. I had mediated a border conflict involving a civilization that experienced time slightly differently from the rest of us, which made scheduling meetings an absolute nightmare. I had once talked a beetle-shaped ambassador down from declaring economic war over a misplaced comma in a treaty footnote. I was, by any professional measure, a composed and careful person. I laughed for 40 seconds straight. My aide, a young man named Colin Marsh who had only been on the job for 3 months, looked at me with wide eyes and then started laughing too, because my laugh is apparently contagious. Then the 2 security officers standing behind us started. Then the entire human delegation of 9 people dissolved into barely contained, shoulder-shaking, face-hiding laughter in the middle of the most important diplomatic event in 10,000 years. Drathon Vel stared at us with all 6 of his eyes. His translator chip was working fine. He knew we understood every word. He simply could not process what was happening. In Cathari culture, laughter in a formal war council is a signal. It means either that the laughing party has gone completely mad, or that they welcome death so completely that they find the whole situation amusing. He chose to interpret our reaction as the second option. He squared his massive shoulders, lifted his chin, and announced in a voice like grinding stone that the humans had accepted their fate with warrior's grace. That made Colin laugh so hard he had to leave the room. Let me tell you what the Cathari actually expected. They expected a species that had only been part of the galactic community for 300 years, a species with no inherited fleet technology, no ancient battle records, no legendary warrior bloodline, to simply buckle. We were the newest members of the 47. Every other civilization in that chamber had been around for at least 2,000 years. Several of them had existed before humans had invented the wheel. The Orathi, the oldest species in the room, had survived 3 separate galactic-scale conflicts, and had the quiet, patient stillness of something that had outlived everything it had ever feared. Humanity, by comparison, was a child who had only recently learned to walk on the cosmic stage. That was exactly how everyone saw us. Brilliant, creative, energetic, occasionally baffling, but young, fragile, untested in the way that mattered. The 10,000-year peace, called the Pax Galactica, had been signed before humanity had its first cities. It was negotiated between 9 founding species after the last great galactic conflict, a war so destructive that entire star systems had been left uninhabitable. The treaty was considered the greatest achievement in the history of intelligent life. Its principles were taught to every child of every species. Peace was not just a preference. It was the foundation everything else was built on. Humans missed the whole thing. We were somewhere between discovering agriculture and arguing about which river valley to settle in when those 9 species sat down and changed the course of history. By the time we reached the stars, the Pax Galactica was ancient. It was background noise. It was assumed. Every species assumed it, every species except us. I stopped laughing eventually. I composed myself, straightened my jacket, and looked across the chamber at Drathunvel, who was now accepting formal acknowledgments of the war declaration from every other species. Their reactions ranged from horror to stunned silence to very careful diplomatic neutrality. The Veil Ambassador, a being made of soft luminescent tissue that communicated partly through light pulses, flickered a shade of deep violet that their species reserved for grief. The ancient Orathi elder, who sat so still she could have been carved from stone, simply watched. Drathunvel finally turned back to the human gallery and asked, in the formal tongue of galactic proceedings, whether the human delegation wished to make a statement in response to the declaration. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my jacket. I looked at him directly with the particular kind of calm that comes not from having nothing to fear, but from having already thought through everything you fear and made your peace with it. I told him that humanity received the declaration, acknowledged its terms, and would be responding through the appropriate diplomatic channels within 72 hours. He seemed surprised that I had something as mundane as a process for this. I sat back down. Colin leaned over and asked me, very quietly, what we were actually going to do. I told him we were going to do exactly what we had been quietly, carefully, patiently doing for the last 297 years. We were going to show up prepared. He nodded slowly. Then he asked if we were actually prepared. I thought about the briefings I had read, the facilities I had visited, the conversations I had sat in on in rooms that did not officially exist. I thought about a single line I had memorized from a document written before I was born, before my parents were born, before their grandparents were born. A line that some long-dead human strategist had written in the very first year of humanity's membership in the galactic community, when we sat down as a species and looked at the vast, ancient, complicated universe around us and asked ourselves, very seriously, one very important question. What do we do if the peace ends? I told Colin yes, we were prepared. Then I told him to stop shaking his knee because it was making the whole row of seats vibrate. He stopped. Outside the chamber, through the great curved windows of the conclave station, the stars were perfectly still. 47 civilizations held the future in their hands, and somewhere at the edge of known space, something that had been quietly waiting for 300 years began, very calmly, to wake up. I have a theory about the difference between species that survive and species that do not, and it comes down to one question that each civilization answers differently at some point in its history. The question is this: do you believe in luck, or do you believe in preparation? The Cathari believed in strength. The Veil believed in cooperation. The Orathi believed in patience so vast it stretched across geological time. Most species believed in the Pax Galactica, in the architecture of peace itself, trusting that a structure 10,000 years old was solid enough to stand forever. Humans believed in the drawer under the bed. Every human family I have ever known has a version of this. A flashlight kept charged even when the power never goes out. A first aid kit in the car that has never been needed. A spare key hidden somewhere sensible. An extra month of food in the back of the pantry because prices change and things happen. We call it being practical. We have been doing it so long that we do not even think about it anymore. It is just who we are. When humanity joined the galactic community 300 years ago, our first official act was to smile, shake hands or equivalent appendages with 46 other species, and sign the Pax Galactica with great ceremony and genuine enthusiasm. Our second act, conducted quietly, without ceremony, was to ask ourselves what we would do if it fell apart. I was in the elevator going down to Sub-Level 9 of Earth Strategic Command when Commander Neil Harding met me at the door and handed me a security badge that did not have my name on it. This was standard for the facility. Nothing in Sub-Level 9 had real names on it. The place did not officially exist. And the humans who worked there were officially assigned to a number of very boring administrative departments scattered across 3 different continents. Neil was one of the most straightforward people I had ever met in my life, which made him ideal for his job. He was the kind of man who said exactly what he meant on the first try, wasted no words, and had the steady energy of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. He had been working in this facility for 19 years. He handed me a data pad as we walked and started talking before I had finished reading the cover page. 300 years, he told me. That was how long the program had been running without a single public mention. 300 years of careful, patient, systematic work by thousands of people who had agreed collectively to keep the biggest secret in human history. Not because they were ordered to, but because they understood something important. The peace would not last forever. It never does. And when it ended, humanity was not going to be standing in the street with empty hands. The first thing I saw when the main vault door opened was the drones. Not a few of them. Not a test batch. Rows upon rows of them, stacked in racking systems that rose 40 meters to the ceiling, each unit identical, each unit charged, each unit waiting. There were enough of them in that room alone to fill the skis of a medium-sized planet. Neil told me this was one of 7 such rooms in this facility, and this facility was one of 14 like it scattered across the solar system. I stopped walking. I stood in the middle of that room and just looked up. Neil let me look. He had given this tour before, and he knew that the first few minutes needed no commentary. The drones were only the beginning. The next room held energy weapons, not the borrowed or licensed versions of technology we had quietly purchased through normal galactic trade channels, but our own versions, redesigned from first principles, stripped of the inefficiencies that the original inventors had left in, because they had never needed to solve for certain specific problems. Humans had spent 3 centuries solving for specific problems that no other species had bothered to consider, because no other species had expected to need the answers. The room after that was the one that made Colin, who had joined us at some point, go very quiet. It held psychological systems, not weapons in the traditional sense, tools designed to disrupt coordination, undermine confidence, create hesitation at critical moments. Things that worked not on the body but on the mind. Neil explained them with the same calm tone he used for everything. Colin asked who had designed these. Neil told him the original concepts came from historians, actually. People who had spent careers studying every recorded conflict in galactic history and identifying the invisible turning points, the moments where the outcome shifted not because of firepower but because of doubt. The Cathari had fought 11 wars across their history. They had won 9 of them. In the 2 they lost, the pattern was the same. Not outgunned, not outmaneuvered. They had simply, at a critical moment, stopped believing they could win. And once that belief cracked, it spread through their command structure like a fracture through glass. Someone had written that analysis 260 years ago and filed it under a reference number that led nowhere interesting. Underneath it, in plain language, they had written a single sentence: "Find a way to use this." We had found several ways. But here is what I want to be clear about, because I think it matters, and because I am the one telling this story. The stockpile was not just things designed to hurt. The vault system went on, and not all of it was weapons. There were medical systems, field hospitals that could be assembled in under an hour and treat species we had never encountered in environments we had never trained in. There were communication arrays, translation systems, food synthesis units, water processing modules, structural repair drones that could rebuild a destroyed outpost in days. There were psychological support programs for traumatized civilian populations, designed not by military strategists, but by doctors, counselors, and social workers who had asked themselves what people needed after a conflict ended and worked backward from there. Humanity had prepared for the war. We had also prepared for what comes after, because we had studied enough history to know that winning a fight is not the hard part. The hard part is what you build once the dust settles. Neil stopped at the last room and pulled up a document on the wall display. It was old. The formatting was simple, the language was plain, and it had been written in the first year of humanity's presence in the galactic community by a woman named Dr. Agnes Calloway, who had been part of the original contact team and had returned home afterward and written a very long report that no one read carefully enough. At the top of the report, as a kind of preface, she had written a single line. Neil had shown it to every person who came through this facility for the past 12 years. It was not classified. It was not dramatic. It was just true. The line read, "The peace is a gift, not a guarantee. Spend it wisely." The Cathari First Strike Fleet arrived at the edge of human-designated space approximately 18 hours after the declaration. It was not a small force. Drathon Vel had committed significant resources because he expected a short engagement. He expected to establish a presence in human space, force a negotiation from a position of power, and walk away with territorial and trade concessions that would shift the balance of galactic influence in his favor for generations. His fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel and immediately slowed to a halt. Their sensors were reading things that should not have been there. A field of objects, thousands of them, distributed across the approach corridor in a pattern that did not match any known military formation in any database the Cathari had access to. The objects were not transmitting any signal. They were not moving. They were simply there, patient and dark and perfectly arranged, like something that had been waiting for a very long time. The fleet's senior tactical officer sent a report to Drathon Vel. The warlord read it and was quiet for a long moment. He asked how long those objects had been in position. The answer that came back was the answer I had been waiting years for someone to give him. At least a decade, probably longer. I got the report on a tablet while I was eating breakfast. I read it once, set the tablet down, and drank my coffee. Good, I thought, they found the first layer. The battle did not start the way battles do in stories. In stories, there is usually a moment where both sides face each other and something dramatic happens before the fighting begins. A speech, a signal, some kind of ceremony that marks the line between before and after. Real engagements do not work that way. One moment things are tense and still, and the next moment everything is moving at once and there is no longer any time for speeches. I was aboard the command ship when the Cathari fleet made its decision. They had spent 4 hours running scans on the objects in the approach corridor, sending probe drones forward, pulling the drones back, running more scans. Their tactical staff was trying to understand what they were looking at, and they could not, because what they were looking at had not been designed according to any school of military thinking they had ever encountered. It had been designed by people who had studied their methods specifically, and then built something that their methods had no framework for. Eventually, Drathon Vel made the only decision available to a commander who does not understand the obstacle in front of him. He went through it. The first wave of Cathari ships accelerated into the corridor. My hands were flat on the console in front of me. Lieutenant Greg Patton, who had been running tactical operations for 6 years, and had the kind of focus that makes other people around him feel steadier just by being near him, stood at the main display with his arms at his sides, watching the readouts. 40 seconds into the advance, the corridor woke up. The objects were not weapons in the conventional sense. They did not fire at the incoming ships in the way that the Cathari were trained to respond to. Instead, they activated a layered disruption field that was specifically calibrated to interfere with Cathari targeting systems, communication protocols, and navigation synchronization. The effect was not destruction. It was confusion. Ships that had entered the corridor in tight, precise formation began to drift from their positions. Targeting solutions that should have been simple became complicated. Commanders who should have been receiving clear status reports began getting conflicting information. The Cathari were not being stopped. They were being turned into a problem for themselves. Greg said quietly that the field was holding at 92% coverage. I nodded and told him to bring up the drone reserves when the second wave crossed marker 7. He acknowledged without looking away from the display. The second wave crossed marker 7 11 minutes later. By then the first wave was in serious trouble, not because they had taken catastrophic losses, but because 3 of their command ships had lost formation coherence, and 2 others had begun maneuvering to avoid each other in ways that were not coordinated with the broader fleet movement. The beautiful, precise military machine that Drathonvel had spent years building had walked into something it could not read, and it was beginning to come apart at the joints. The drones came up from the reserves. There were 4,000 of them in this engagement, a number that represented a small fraction of what was available. They did not attack in a mass formation. They moved in small, independent clusters using a distributed targeting system that had no central command node to disable. Each cluster made its own decisions based on shared sensor data and a priority hierarchy that had been loaded before the battle began. They were not dramatic. They were methodical. They found gaps, they applied pressure. They withdrew when the risk calculation shifted against them. And they did it all without any communication that the Cathari systems could intercept or jam. That was when I noticed something change in the readouts. A cluster of data points on the left side of the display shifted in a way that meant something I had hoped not to see. Greg saw it at the same moment. He said it quietly. 3 of our ships had taken direct fire in the outer defensive ring. 2 were holding, 1 was not. I kept my voice level and asked for the crew count on the 3rd vessel. The answer came back, 41 people. I asked for a status on evacuation. The answer was 26 confirmed away, then 29, then 31. I turned back to the main display and kept working. This is not because I did not care. It is because caring and continuing are not opposites, and the 41 people aboard that ship had taken their position knowing exactly what the risk was, the same way every person in our fleet had. The way to honor that is not to stop. It is to make sure that the thing they were part of actually matters. Captain Dana Wheeler came over to my station and stood beside me without saying anything for a moment. Dana was one of those people who had been in difficult situations so many times that her presence itself was calming, not because she was relaxed, but because she was so completely and functionally herself under pressure that being near her reminded you that humans were built for this. We always had been. She told me that the Cathari second wave was beginning to lose formation cohesion as well. Their command network was trying to compensate for the disruption fields, but the compensation signals were being read by our systems, and we were adjusting faster than they could keep up. She said it with the professional satisfaction of someone whose careful, years-long work was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. I asked her how long before the first wave began trying to withdraw. She said her estimate was about 20 minutes. She was off by 3. The Cathari first wave pulled back, not in a rout, in a managed retreat, which told me that their commanders were still functioning and still making rational decisions, which was important, because the last thing anyone needed was a desperate fleet that had stopped thinking. A retreating enemy that is still thinking can be negotiated with. One that has stopped thinking is a different problem entirely. The second wave held position at the edge of the corridor and did not advance further. For about 40 minutes, nothing moved. Both sides were in a kind of mutual assessment, reading each other's disposition, trying to understand what the next step looked like. I used that time to walk to the back of the bridge and drink a glass of water and sit with the number. 31 confirmed away from the lost ship. That meant 10 people unaccounted for, and by that point in the engagement, unaccounted for had a meaning that everyone in the room understood and no one said out loud. Colin found me and sat down across the small table and did not say anything for a while, which was the right call. Across the chamber on the Galactic broadcast network, which had been streaming the engagement to every species in the community, the reaction was almost as interesting as the battle itself. I had access to a summary feed. The Vale ambassador had reportedly stopped being able to emit coherent light pulses and was simply sitting in a dim, still state that their species uses when processing something too large for immediate understanding. Several of the mid-tier species had begun moving their own assets to more defensible positions, not because they thought the conflict would spread, but because watching what was happening in that corridor had apparently reminded them that the universe was not as safe as they had assumed. The ancient Orathi elder had not moved. She was watching the feed with the same still attention she brought to everything. One of her aides reported later that she had said nothing throughout the entire engagement except for 3 words, spoken quietly to herself at the moment our drone clusters deployed. She had said, "There it is." The Cathari fleet did not advance again. Drathon Vel spent another 2 hours repositioning, scanning, and doing the kind of tactical evaluation that a commander does when the plan he had committed to has not worked, and he is trying to decide what the revised plan looks like. I gave him the time. We were not in a hurry. Patience is something humans understand in a particular way that is difficult to explain to species that have not spent thousands of years being the smaller, slower, weaker thing in a world full of things that could end them. When his communication request came through, it was formal and used the correct diplomatic codes, which told me that Drathon Vel was still a professional even in a situation he had not expected. I respected that, even then. He requested a pause in hostilities of indeterminate length to allow for assessment and potential negotiation. I looked at Greg, he looked at me. I looked at Dana, she raised one eyebrow. I sent back our response. 72 hours. We would observe the ceasefire for 72 hours. After that, the terms would need to be discussed in a proper setting with proper representation. Then I went to the back of the bridge where the small kitchen unit was, found the coffee supply that Lieutenant Patton had been hoarding for what he called special circumstances, and made a full pot. The crew drifted back in small groups. Someone found a packet of biscuits. 2 of the drone operators, whose systems were now in passive monitoring mode, started a quiet argument about something entirely unrelated to the battle, which told me they were decompressing in the way humans do, filling the silence with ordinary noise to remind themselves that ordinary things still exist. I poured coffee into a plain cup and held it with both hands and thought about the 31 who had made it out and the 10 who had not. I thought about the 7 rooms of drones in Sublevel 9 and the line Dr. Calloway had written 300 years ago. I thought about how strange it was to be standing in this particular moment, at the other end of all that quiet, patient preparation. Outside the command ship's windows, the Cathari fleet was holding position. Dark shapes against a darker background, still and watchful and trying to understand what had just happened to them. I finished my coffee, then I went back to work. The first time Drathon Vel asked me why we had laughed, we were sitting across a table in a neutral station 3 weeks after the ceasefire had held. He asked it in the formal tongue of galactic proceedings, which meant it was an official question. He had thought about it long enough that he wanted a real answer. His crest was lowered. His 4 arms were resting flat on the table surface, which in Cathari body language signals that the speaker has set aside their rank for the moment, and is speaking as a person rather than a commander. I told him that we laughed because we recognized the situation, not from this war, from every other one. He waited. I told him to think about what he knew of human history, the parts that were in galactic records. 300 years of membership in the community, during which time humans had been regarded as charming newcomers with interesting art and no serious military heritage. Before that, according to our own records which we had made available to the community on joining, somewhere between 10 and 12,000 years of civilization, roughly. Cities, agriculture, writing, philosophy, science, industry, space travel. The usual sequence. What the galactic records did not fully capture, I told him, was what that 10,000 years actually looked like from the inside. It looked like conflict. Not constant conflict, but recurring. Cycles of peace and disruption and peace again, each time different, each time teaching us something new about how fragile the structures we built could be. We did not have a 10,000-year peace. We had a human-scale version of history, which meant we understood in our bones, in the part of us that is older than language, that peace requires maintenance. It requires attention. It requires that someone somewhere is always asking the uncomfortable question. What do we do if this ends? Drathonvel was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question I had expected. He said, "Why did you not simply trust the Pax Galactica? It had held for 10,000 years. It was the framework your species entered into. Why assume it would fail?" I looked at him for a moment before answering. I told him that 10,000 years is a long time for species that have been around for 50 or 100,000 years. For a civilization 300 years into its galactic membership, 10,000 years of recorded peace is the history of something that happened before you arrived. It is like a child being told that the road in front of the house has never had an accident. The child was not there for all those years of safe passage. The child only knows that accidents happen because the child has seen them. It would be strange, I said, for a species with our history to walk into a new situation and assume that the past was a guarantee of the future. He sat with that for a while. The translator systems rendered the silence as silence, which I appreciated. Then he asked something I had not expected. He asked whether we had actually wanted to use what we had built, whether somewhere in the human command structure someone had been hopping for an opportunity. It was a fair question, and it deserved a real answer. I told him no, and I told him why I believed that, which was the more important part. The people I had met in Sublevel 9, the engineers and analysts and doctors who had spent their careers in those quiet rooms, were not people who wanted a war. They were people who had looked at the evidence of what happens when you are unprepared for one, and decided they were not willing to let that happen. There is a difference between building a defense because you want to use it and building one because you would rather never have to. Most people, I told him, cannot tell those apart from the outside, but the people inside it know the difference in how it feels every single day. He asked about the post-war systems, the medical infrastructure, the rebuilding tools, the civilian support programs. He had been briefed on them by his own intelligence staff, and the information had clearly affected him. He asked why those things were part of the same program as the weapons. I told him because one without the other is not actually a plan. It is just a way of making the next problem larger. There was a pause in the room. The other delegates, seated along both sides of the table, had gone very still. Admiral Lucy Harmon, who was sitting 2 seats to my left and had been quietly monitoring the proceedings, glanced at me once with the particular expression she uses when she thinks something is going well. The Galactic Council session that followed the bilateral talks was one of the more remarkable events I have been present for in 11 years of diplomatic work. Every species sent their senior representative. The Orathi Elder, whose name translated approximately as the one who has waited long enough, was there. The Veil, still flickering irregularly from the stress of the past weeks, were there. Species I had only ever interacted with through recorded communications were physically present in the chamber. One by one, in no particular order, they began to speak, not to address each other, to address the room, to say things that had apparently been sitting unspoken for quite some time. The ambassador from the Surath, a species with complex layered vocal cords that made their speech sound like several conversations happening simultaneously, stood and said that they had observed human activity in certain restricted research areas over the past 50 years, and had chosen not to report it to the community because they had assumed it was civilian development. This admission was greeted with what might charitably be described as mixed reactions. The Pelorn representative, who was very old and moved very slowly but was extraordinarily precise when she spoke, said that her civilization had noticed human resource allocation patterns 3 generations ago that did not match what a purely civilian economy would produce, and had discussed it internally and concluded that the human government was managing a strategic reserve. She said they had not reported it because they judged it to be prudent behavior, and because they had concluded that a species preparing for contingencies was less dangerous than one that was not. Then the Arathi elder, who had not yet spoken, stood. The room settled into a particular quality of silence that I have come to associate with the presence of something very old and very considered. She said that she had seen this before, not this specific situation, but the shape of it. A young species, entering an old community, finding the community comfortable in its assumptions, deciding quietly not to share that comfort. She said she had watched the human delegation during the battle broadcasts and had recognized something in our tactics that she had not seen since the last galactic conflict, which was the only conflict her species had personally fought in. She said what she recognized was not aggression. It was not ambition. It was something harder to name and more important than either. She said what she recognized was clarity. The clarity of a people who had been honest with themselves about what the world actually is, rather than what they hoped it would be. Then she said she had been waiting to see if the young species would have it. She said she was satisfied. That was the longest speech the Arathi elder made in any proceeding I ever witnessed her attend. After the other species finished speaking, it was the Cathari turn. Drathonvel stood. He was not the same person who had stood at the center podium 3 weeks ago with his crest raised and his arms spread wide, full of the certainty that he was about to reshape galactic history in his favor. He was still an impressive figure. He was still the warlord, but something had changed in him in a way that I found, unexpectedly, I had some respect for. The ability to be changed by events is not a weakness. Most people who have the rank and the history to prevent it choose rigidity instead. He acknowledged that the Cathari Declaration had been a strategic miscalculation based on incorrect assumptions about human military capacity. He did not minimize it or dress it up in diplomatic language. He said it plainly, which cost him something in front of the assembled representatives of 46 other species, and he paid that cost without flinching. Then he looked at me directly and said that, when he had entered the chamber 3 weeks ago, he had believed he understood humanity. He said he had been wrong. He said he would like to understand us correctly, and he asked if we were willing to help him do that. I slid a document across the table. He looked at it. He read the first page. He read the second. He flipped through to the third, and I watched the moment land, watched his posture change slightly as he processed what he was holding. He said, "You wrote this before the war began." I said yes. He said, "How long before?" I told him it had been in final draft form for 9 years, and in preliminary draft for significantly longer. It had been updated as circumstances evolved, but the core framework had been written by a team of people who had never expected to be in this room, who had simply believed that if a conflict ever came, it would eventually end, and whoever was left at the end would need something to work from. He set the document down carefully. He said, "This is a peace treaty." I said yes. He said, "A comprehensive one." I said we had tried to be thorough. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I did not expect. He said that in Cathari history, every peace treaty they had ever signed had been written by the victors with the purpose of securing their advantage. He said he had never seen a treaty document that was written with the purpose of making the arrangement actually work for everyone involved. I told him we had studied enough history to know what happens when treaties are written only for the winner. They last until the loser recovers enough to resent them openly, and then you are back in the same room having the same conversation with different names on the chairs. He made a sound that his translator rendered as a long exhale. I believe it was the Cathari equivalent of a reluctant laugh. Lucy leaned forward slightly in her chair. She said, in the same quiet professional voice she used for everything, that if the warlord wished, they could begin reviewing the document together, section by section, and address any terms that required adjustment. The human team was prepared to negotiate in good faith on any point that represented a genuine concern. Drathon Vel looked at Lucy. He looked at me. He looked at Colin, who had been taking careful notes throughout the entire session, and looked up at that precise moment with his pen poised, completely ready, as if he had been built for exactly this. The warlord sat down. He said, "Let us begin." 6 months after the ceasefire, I went back to Sub-Level 9. The facility looked the same. The elevator still made the small mechanical click on the way down that it had always made. The badge still did not have my name on it. Neil Harding met me at the door, same as before, and handed me a security badge, same as before, and said, "Good to see you," same as always. But something was different about the place, not in its structure or its layout, different in the way a room feels when the purpose that defined it has shifted. The drones were still there. The systems were still there. The rooms were still full of the quiet, patient work of people who understood that their job was not finished. But the tension that had lived in the air of this facility for as long as it had existed had changed character slightly. It was still serious. It was just no longer quite as braced. Neil walked me to a new section that had been added to the facility during the conflict period. It was a different kind of room from the ones I had seen before. Long tables with screens and teams of people in non-military clothing, working through data, writing reports, running projections. I recognized some of the work immediately. It was reconstruction planning, detailed logistics for helping the regions of space that had been affected by the engagement recover their normal function. There were teams working on Cathari civilian infrastructure specifically, because the sanctions and blockades and general disruption of a conflict period do not stop at the border of whoever started it. Regular people on both sides end up affected, and regular people on both sides deserve someone thinking clearly about what they need. I asked Neil whose idea this team had been. He told me it was in the original document, the one Dr. Calloway had written 300 years ago. There was a section in the appendix, largely overlooked when people focused on the strategic elements, that described in careful detail what a responsible conflict conclusion should look like. It had been referred to internally for years as the appendix that nobody wanted to talk about, because talking about it meant accepting that you were taking conflict seriously enough to plan for its aftermath, and that was an uncomfortable level of honesty. When the ceasefire came, someone had pulled out the appendix and started making calls. I spent a while walking through that room and the ones adjacent to it, not inspecting, just looking. There were people in those rooms who had spent their careers working in a facility that officially did not exist, on plans that they sincerely hoped would never be needed, and now they had been needed, and those people were still here, still working, doing the hard, unglamorous part that never makes it into the stories. I stopped at the memorial board that had been added to the corridor outside the main operations room after the battle. It was a plain board, white background, names in clean black text, 47 people, the 10 from the vessel that had gone down in the first engagement, and 37 others from various operations across the conflict period that most people outside the military community did not know had happened. 47 names on a plain board in a hallway that did not exist. I read every one of them. It took a few minutes. I did not rush. When I was finished, I stood there for a moment, and I thought about what the Orathi elder had said. Clarity. That was the word she had used. The clarity of a people who had been honest with themselves about what the world actually is. I have thought about that word many times since. Clarity is not the same as certainty. Clarity does not mean you know how things will turn out. It means you have looked at the situation clearly enough to understand what it actually requires of you, and then you have tried to meet that requirement honestly, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it means building things you hope you never have to use, even when it means sitting in a room that does not exist reading a document that your predecessors wrote in the hope that you would never need it. Dr. Calloway had never expected to be famous. She had written a report and gone home and lived the rest of her life doing other things. The report had sat in an archive for a few years and then found its way to people who took it seriously and built something from it. And those people had trained others, and those others had trained others. And 300 years later, a room full of humans was sitting across a table from a Cathari warlord, negotiating a peace using a treaty that had been in draft for 9 years. She would have found that funny, I think, in the good way. The Orathi elder came to the signing ceremony for the new peace treaty. She did not have to. The Orathi rarely attend events they do not consider historically significant, but she was there, seated at the far left end of the observation gallery, still and quiet as always, watching the 47 signatories add their marks to a document that reset the peace to 0. 10,000 years ended, a new one begun. After the ceremony, I found myself near the observation window, looking out at the station's exterior view. Stars everywhere. The kind of view that should feel peaceful and did mostly, except that I have spent enough time thinking about history to know that peaceful is a condition with a variable duration, and the variable is always the same one. What do people do with the time they have? Colin appeared beside me. He had grown into his job considerably over the past 6 months. The shaking knee had mostly stopped. He was still young, but he was the kind of young that is becoming something else at a pace that, if you are paying attention, you can actually watch. He asked me what I was thinking about. I told him I was thinking about the next 10,000 years, about what we would do with them, about whether this time, with a better treaty and a harder one understanding of what the peace actually requires, we might make it last a little longer, and about whether the teams in sub-level 9 would keep working anyway, because that is what you do when you understand something clearly. He asked whether I thought the peace would hold. I looked at him. He was asking a genuine question, the way young people ask questions when they have been through something real and come out the other side wanting to understand what it means. I told him I thought it would hold for a while. I thought the new treaty was better than the old one because it had been written by people who took it seriously instead of people who assumed it would take care of itself. I thought the Cathari, and the Vale, and the Pelorn, and the Surath, and all the others had seen something they would not forget quickly. I thought the Orathi elder had been right when she said clarity was the thing, and that it was possible for that clarity to spread over time if the people who had it kept working. And I told him that the teams in sub-level 9 would keep working, not because they wanted another war, because preparation is not a statement of despair. It is a statement of responsibility. You do not prepare for the worst because you have given up on the best. You prepare because the best outcome does not build itself, and neither does the safety net under it. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the stars. Then he said, very quietly, that he thought he finally understood why we had laughed. I asked him to tell me. He said, because we already knew the ending was going to be us at a table, writing a treaty. We just had to get through the middle part first. I thought about that. I thought about Drathon Vel sitting down at the table and saying, "Let us begin." I thought about the Orathi elder saying, "There it is." I thought about 47 names on a plain board in a corridor that did not exist. I told Colin he was not wrong. The new treaty was signed. The chamber emptied slowly, the way large formal rooms always do, people moving in small groups toward different destinations, carrying with them different pieces of what had just happened. A new piece, 10,000 years reset to 0. I stayed at the window a little longer. We would be ready when this one ended too. I did not feel good about that. I did not feel bad about it either. I felt human. And in this universe, in this moment, standing at the edge of a new 10,000 years with 47 names remembered, and a treaty signed, and a long table of work still waiting to be done. That felt like exactly enough.